The cold was not merely an absence of warmth. It was a physical presence. It had teeth that bit into the frozen mud of the town's only street, and a voice that howled around the corners of the false-fronted buildings, carrying with it the fine, sharp dust of the plains. It was a predator, and it had found its quarry huddled in the sliver of shelter offered by the overhang of the general store. The woman and the child were its chosen victims, and the town had long since turned its back, pulling its own collars tighter and pretending not to see. She was an island of misery in a sea of determined indifference. Her shawl, a thin and ragged thing the color of dishwater, was no match for the wind's invasive chill. She had wrapped it around the small, silent form of her son, leaving her own shoulders to bear the brunt of the assault. Her dress was meant for a different season, a different life, its faded print a ghostly memory of sun and warmth. It was hopelessly inadequate, a fact that seemed to provide a certain grim satisfaction to the faces that glanced their way from behind steamy panes of glass. They were outsiders, their language a soft, melodic counterpoint to the town's clipped, hard-edged speech, and their poverty was an affront, a public stain on the rough-hewn pride of the settlement. The woman kept her gaze fixed on a point somewhere beyond the miserable street, a point of memory or hope that was invisible to everyone else. Her dignity was a fragile shield, the last thing she owned, and she held it up against the scornful glances and the calculated silence of the townsfolk. The child, a boy of no more than 5, did not cry. He had learned that tears only made the cold worse, freezing on his cheeks. He simply shivered, his small body a tight knot of endurance, his face buried in the thin wool of his mother's dress. They had been there for 2 days, moving only when the store owner shooed them away like stray dogs, their desperation growing with each passing hour as the sun, a pale and distant wafer in the gray sky, offered no comfort. From the window of her husband's mercantile, the most prosperous in the county, the merchant's wife watched them. Her face, usually set in a mask of placid superiority, was tightened into a knot of disapproval. She saw not a mother and child in desperate need, but a blight, an inconvenience that lowered the tone of the entire town. She had made her opinion known to the marshal, but the lawman, a man who preferred to deal with problems that could be solved with a drawn gun, had merely shrugged. Vagrancy was a nuisance, but the cold, he had said, would likely solve the problem for him before long. The merchant's wife found his pragmatism distasteful, but could not argue with its logic. Then, a new shape appeared at the far end of the street, solid and deliberate. A man on a horse, leading a pack mule. He was a familiar yet distant figure to the town. The rancher. He owned the sprawling, isolated homestead miles out, a place bordered by rocky mesas and unforgiving winds. He came to town only when necessity demanded, his face weathered by sun and solitude into a mask as unreadable as the rock formations on his land. He did not speak unless spoken to, and his words were as sparse and essential as the winter landscape. The town knew of him, of course. They knew he had buried a wife and a daughter in the small plot behind his cabin some years back, and since then, the silence of his grief had become as much a part of his property as the fences and the cattle. He dismounted in front of the general store, his movements economical and sure. His eyes, the color of a winter sky just before a snow, swept over the street, missing nothing. They paused on the woman and child. The town held a collective, silent breath. They expected him to ignore them, as everyone else had. Or perhaps, given his reputation for bluntness, to tell them to move on. He was not a man known for sentiment. The rancher's gaze was not one of pity. Pity was a soft, useless thing. It was an assessment. He saw the cracked, chapped skin of the woman's hands, the blue tinge of her lips. He saw the fierce, protective way she held the child, a gesture of defiance against the universe itself. But most of all, he saw the look in her eyes as she finally met his gaze. It was not the vacant stare of defeat. It was a banked fire, a smoldering ember of will that had refused against all odds to be extinguished. It was a look he recognized, a distant echo of the one he saw in his own shaving mirror each morning. He tethered his horse and walked not into the store, but directly toward her. The wind whipped at his heavy coat, but he seemed not to notice. He stopped a few feet away, a bulwark against the biting wind. The woman flinched, expecting a command to leave, but held her ground. "You can't stay here," he said. His voice was low and gravelly, like stones rolling in a dry creek bed. It was not an accusation. It was a statement of fact. She did not answer, merely pulled the child closer. Inside the store, the merchant's wife watched, her lips pursed in a thin, disapproving line. She saw the arrival of a man from the woman's past, a slickly dressed creditor who had been making inquiries, and a cruel idea began to form. He stepped out onto the boardwalk, his gaze landing on the woman with an air of predatory ownership. "There she is," the creditor said, his voice loud enough to carry. "The debt. The marshal says I can take what I'm owed." He smiled, a greasy, unpleasant expression. He approached the rancher, dismissing him as an obstacle. "This is my property, friend. A debt left unpaid by her husband." The rancher's eyes narrowed slightly. He looked from the creditor's smug face to the woman's terrified one. He had come to town for salt, flour, and fence wire. He had not come looking for complications. But the silence in his cabin had been growing louder of late, a hollow ache that no amount of hard work could fill. He saw the cold, the town's cruelty, and this man's possessive greed, and it all coalesced into a single, hard decision. He turned his gaze back to the woman. "I have work," he said, ignoring the creditor completely. "A roof. Food. It's hard work, but it's warm." The creditor scoffed. "She's not for hire. She's collateral." He held up a piece of paper, a promissory note. "The price to clear the debt is $10. It was an absurd sum, more than the woman could ever hope to see. The town was watching now, the street a silent theater. The rancher looked at the paper, then back at the woman. He saw the tremor in her hands, the fight in her eyes. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a worn leather pouch. He didn't have $10 in cash. He had 3 silver dollars and some change. He looked the creditor dead in the eye. "I'll give you $3 for your piece of paper." A ripple of laughter went through the small crowd of onlookers. The creditor's face flushed with anger. "Are you mocking me? Her debt is 10. "Your paper is worthless if she freezes to death tonight," the rancher stated, his voice flat and unyielding. "Then you have nothing. $3 is more than the wind will pay you." He held out the coins in his palm. "Take it or leave it. The storm's not waiting." The creditor hesitated, his eyes darting from the coins to the darkening sky. He was a creature of leverage, and he knew he was losing it. The woman was his only asset, and a dead asset was no asset at all. He snatched the coins from the rancher's hand with a sneer. "Fine, take the baggage. You've bought yourself a world of trouble." He stalked off toward the saloon, leaving the now useless promissory note to be snatched by the wind. The rancher looked at the woman. He had not bought her. He had bought her freedom from this specific cage, for this specific moment. He had paid $3 to silence the laughter of the town and the claims of a vulture. He had done it for a reason he did not fully understand himself, only that the ember in her eyes demanded it. "The offer stands," he said, his voice unchanged. "Work for shelter." She looked at him, her dark eyes searching his face for a trick, for the shape of the trap. She found nothing but a vast, weary emptiness and a core of something hard and unshakable. It was not kindness. It was necessity. Her own necessity met his. With a slow, deliberate nod, she rose to her feet, her body stiff with cold. She took her son's hand. She had no other choice on this earth. She would accept. He gave a curt nod, as if he had expected nothing less, and turned toward his wagon without looking back to see if she followed. He knew she would. The world had left her no other path. The journey to the homestead was a study in silence. The rancher loaded his meager supplies into the buckboard wagon, then helped the woman and child onto the seat without a word. He threw a thick, rough wool blanket over their laps, an act of such impersonal practicality that it felt less like a kindness and more like the proper maintenance of new equipment. The wheels of the wagon groaned in protest against the frozen ruts of the road, and the wind, their constant companion, whispered cruelties in their ears. The woman held her son tightly, the unfamiliar scratch of the blanket a small, solid reality against the terrifying uncertainty of her situation. She watched the man beside her, his hands sure on the reins, his profile stark against the bleak, endless landscape of muted browns and grays. He did not look at her. His focus was entirely on the path ahead, his gaze fixed on the horizon, as if he were navigating by some internal compass invisible to her. She wondered what kind of man paid $3 for a stranger's problem. She wondered what kind of work awaited her at the end of this cold, silent ride. She felt a profound sense of displacement, as if she had been untethered from the world she knew and was now drifting in this man's solitary orbit. For the rancher, the presence of the woman and child was a strange and unsettling weight in the familiar emptiness of his wagon. For years, the only sounds on these journeys had been the clatter of the horse's hooves, the creak of the wagon, and the ceaseless monologue of the wind. Now, there was the faint, rhythmic sound of the child's breathing and the rustle of the blanket. These small, human noises were intrusions, foreign elements in the well-ordered silence of his life. He felt a flicker of something akin to regret, the unease of a man who has acted on an impulse he cannot fully explain. He had seen their desperation and the town's cruelty, and a gear had turned inside him, a mechanism long dormant. He had acted. Now he had to live with the consequences of that action. After what felt like an eternity, the homestead appeared, emerging from the gray twilight not as a welcoming beacon, but as another feature of the harsh landscape. It was a small, sturdy cabin built of dark, weathered logs, with a stone chimney breathing a thin plume of smoke into the sky. A solid barn stood nearby, and a web of corrals stretched out from it. The place was impeccably maintained, but radiated a profound and desolate loneliness. It was the home of a man who did not live in it so much as occupy it, a fortress against the wilderness outside, and, perhaps, the wilderness within. He brought the wagon to a halt and dismounted. "We're here," he announced unnecessarily. He helped her and the child down, his touch brief and functional. He led them inside the cabin. The interior was a reflection of the man himself, brutally simple, clean, and stripped of all but the most essential items. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, a fire already laid and waiting for a match. There was a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, a dry sink, and a bed built into one corner. Everything was in its proper place, organized with a rigid precision that spoke of a life governed by routine. But the air inside was heavy with the same oppressive silence as the landscape. It was a space hollowed out by loss, and the few pieces of furniture felt like lonely sentinels guarding a vast, empty territory. The rancher lit the fire without ceremony, and the flames greedily consumed the kindling, casting flickering shadows that danced on the log walls. He motioned for them to sit at the table while he moved to the stove. He prepared a simple meal of bacon, beans, and hard biscuits, the sounds of his work, the sizzle of the fat, the clank of the iron skillet, filling the void. When the food was ready, he placed 2 plates before them. He did not eat himself, but stood by the fire, nursing a tin cup of coffee, watching them. The boy, who had been a silent statue for hours, fell upon the food with a desperate hunger. The woman ate more slowly, but with a ravenousness that betrayed her long starvation. She ate with her head bowed, as if ashamed of her own need. The rancher watched with a detached curiosity, his face unreadable in the firelight. He was seeing the raw, unvarnished reality of survival, and it was a familiar, if uncomfortable, sight. He was feeding 2 strays he had brought in from the cold. That was all. When they had finished, he took their empty plates. He gestured toward a steep ladder leading to a loft above the main room. "You'll sleep up there. There are blankets." The woman looked up at the dark, open space. It was a clear and unambiguous separation. They were under his roof, but not part of his home. They were a necessity he had acquired, like a new shovel or a sack of grain. She understood the terms of this unspoken contract. She would work, and he would provide this fragile refuge. Nothing more was offered. Nothing more was expected. "Thank you," she whispered, the words feeling small and inadequate in the vast silence of the room. He gave a curt nod, his back already turned to them as he banked the fire for the night. The kindness, she thought as she guided her son toward the ladder, felt as sharp and dangerous as the winter itself. It was a tool, not a comfort, and she did not yet know how it was meant to be used. The storm he had predicted arrived that night, a howling blizzard that descended upon the plains and sealed the cabin in a world of white. For 3 days, the wind screamed and the snow piled in great drifts against the walls and windows, isolating them completely. It was a period of confinement, a forced intimacy in the small, silent space. The rancher moved through his days with the steady, unhurried rhythm of a man long accustomed to his own company. He rose before dawn, his movements quiet and precise in the dim light. He would tend the fire, make coffee, and then disappear into the swirling snow to see to the animals in the barn, returning an hour later covered in a fine layer of ice, his presence bringing a gust of frigid air into the cabin. He spent the remainder of the day engaged in the small, endless tasks of a self-sufficient life, mending a leather harness with a practiced hand, sharpening an axe blade until it gleamed, oiling his rifle with meticulous care. He was a man in constant, restless motion, as if stillness itself was a threat. The woman and her son learned to live in the spaces he left behind. They stayed mostly in the loft, a world of shadows and stored goods, descending only for the simple meals he provided. The boy, whose name was Samuel, remained quiet and watchful, his eyes following the rancher's every move. The woman, whose name he had not yet asked, began to subtly impose her own order on the small domestic sphere. She swept the floor, washed the few dishes, and folded the blankets with a neatness that matched his own. They were small acts, silent statements that she intended to earn her keep, that she would not be merely a passive recipient of his charity. He observed her efforts from the corner of his eye, saying nothing. He noticed the way she organized the pantry, arranging the tins and sacks with a logic that had eluded him. He saw the careful way she patched a small tear in her son's shirt, her stitches tiny and perfect. He saw intelligence in her hands and a quiet determination in the set of her jaw. He had expected a burden. He was discovering a presence. On the 4th morning, the world was reborn in silence and blinding white light. The storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape transformed, pristine and treacherous. The work of digging out began. The rancher bundled himself in heavy clothes, his expression grim as he surveyed the task ahead. He assumed the woman would remain inside, in what he considered her proper place. But as he picked up a shovel, she was there beside him, wrapped in her thin shawl and an old coat of his she had found in a chest. It was far too large for her, but she had cinched it with a piece of rope. "I will help," she said. It was not a question or a plea. It was a statement. He looked at her slight frame against the massive drifts of snow. "This is heavy work." "We will not be sheltered pets," she replied, her voice steady. "We will earn our place here." A flicker of something, surprise, perhaps even respect, passed through his eyes. He hesitated for a moment, then handed her a smaller shovel without another word. He had offered her a roof. She was demanding the right to help maintain it. The work was grueling. The snow was heavy and wet, and the cold was relentless. He worked with a powerful, rhythmic efficiency, tossing huge shovelfuls of snow aside with ease. He expected her to tire quickly, to retreat to the warmth of the cabin, but she did not. She worked with a dogged persistence, her movements smaller but just as determined. When she stumbled, she righted herself without complaint. When her breath came in ragged gasps, she simply paused, leaned on her shovel for a moment, and began again. He found himself adjusting his own pace to hers, a subconscious accommodation he did not even realize he was making. They cleared a path from the cabin to the barn, a deep trench carved through the white wilderness. Inside the barn, he showed her how to feed the livestock and muck out the stalls. She did not flinch from the smell or the filth. She listened to his clipped instructions, watched his movements, and then replicated them with a quick, focused intelligence. She learned to measure the feed, to check the water troughs for ice, to see the subtle signs of a cow favoring a leg. He began to leave more of the indoor chores and the smaller barn tasks to her, not to lighten his own load, but as a silent acknowledgement of her competence. He was a man who valued capability above all else, and she was proving she had it in abundance. One afternoon, while searching for extra thread in a dusty wooden trunk in the loft, her fingers brushed against something hard and smooth. It was a small, crudely carved wooden bird, its wings outstretched as if in mid-flight. The wood was worn smooth, polished by the touch of small hands. It was a child's toy. She held it in her palm, a piece of the rancher's silent, guarded past. She understood then that the emptiness of this house was not just an absence, but a presence, the ghost of a life that had once filled it. She quietly placed the bird back in the trunk and covered it, feeling as if she had trespassed on sacred ground. The discovery did not frighten her. It deepened her understanding of the man. His grief was not a weakness, but the source of the formidable strength and solitude that defined him. He had built this fortress of routine and silence not to keep the world out, but to contain the vastness of his own loss. Weeks bled into a month. The brutal winter slowly began to lose its grip, the days growing fractionally longer, the sun offering a hint of warmth in its pale light. A routine had settled over the homestead, a quiet rhythm of shared work and silent companionship. The woman, whose name he now knew was Elena, and her son Samuel were no longer just temporary fixtures. They were becoming part of the fabric of the place. Samuel, emerging from his shell of silence, had started to talk, his small voice a startling new sound in the cabin. He would follow the rancher on his rounds, asking questions with a child's relentless curiosity, and the rancher, to his own surprise, would answer them in his gruff, concise way. But their fragile sanctuary was an island, and eventually, the need for supplies forced them to return to the world beyond its borders. The journey to town was different this time. Elena sat straighter on the wagon seat, a borrowed but clean dress replacing her rags. Samuel sat between them, no longer a shivering bundle, but a bright-eyed boy. The rancher felt a strange, protective impulse he hadn't anticipated. He was not just taking an employee to town, he was escorting his household. Their arrival did not go unnoticed. As they pulled up to the general store, the merchant's wife emerged, her presence as sharp and unwelcome as a blast of winter wind. She had been waiting for this opportunity, her indignation simmering for weeks. She saw Elena, looking healthier and more confident, and her disapproval curdled into outright malice. Her world was one of rigid social hierarchies, and this arrangement offended her sense of order. She approached the wagon, a saccharine smile plastered on her face that did not reach her cold, calculating eyes. "Well now," she cooed, her voice carrying clearly across the street. "Look what the storm blew in. I see you've taken in charity." She let the word hang in the air, a deliberate insult. She directed her gaze at Elena, her smile tightening. I do hope you're making yourself useful. A man like him has needs. The insinuation was as ugly as it was public. Elena flinched as if struck, her face paling. The few other people on the street stopped to watch, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and cruel anticipation. The rancher, who had been untying a sack of flour from the back of the wagon, slowly straightened up. He turned, and for a moment he did nothing but look at the merchant's wife. His face was devoid of expression, but his eyes were like chips of ice. The air around him seemed to grow colder, heavier. He moved with a deliberate lack of haste, walking around the wagon until he was standing directly between the merchant's wife and Elena. He was not a tall man, but his presence was immense, a solid wall of quiet authority. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "She works for me," he said, his voice a low rumble. The words were simple, factual. "She earns her keep. Her son earns his." He paused, letting the silence stretch. "She is under my protection." The final 4 words were not a threat. They were a declaration, a line drawn in the frozen dirt of the street. "Your business is with your husband's ledger, not my household. I suggest you tend to it." The merchant's wife's smile faltered, replaced by a flush of angry humiliation. She had expected him to be embarrassed, to dismiss the woman. She had not expected this quiet, unshakable defense. She was accustomed to her social standing being a weapon, but it was useless against this man's utter indifference to her opinion. She opened her mouth to retort, but the look in his eyes made her think better of it. With a strangled scoff, she turned on her heel and swept back into her store, defeated. The rancher turned and finished unloading his supplies as if nothing had happened. But Elena saw the tension in his shoulders, the tight grip of his hands on a sack of beans. He had shielded her, had claimed her and her son as his own in the eyes of the town. He was no longer just her rescuer. He was her protector. The ride back to the homestead was consumed by a new kind of silence. It was not the empty silence of strangers, but a silence heavy with unspoken things. The fragile peace of their isolated world had been shattered by the ugliness of the town. They were not just 3 individuals living under one roof. They were a unit, a fortress, and the world outside had just fired its first warning shot. That evening, after the confrontation, the quiet in the cabin felt different. It was no longer a comfortable void, but a space filled with the echoes of the merchant's wife's cruel words. They ate their supper in near silence. Samuel, sensing the tension, was subdued. After the boy was asleep in the loft, Elena came back down the ladder. The rancher was sitting by the fire, staring into the flames. His shoulders slumped with a weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion. He seemed to be wrestling with a thought, turning it over and over like a stone in his hand. Elena stood for a long moment, watching him. The question that had lived inside her since that first day in town finally rose to the surface, demanding to be asked. The events of the day had given her the courage, or perhaps the necessity, to voice it. "Why?" she asked softly. Her voice was barely a whisper, but in the stillness of the room, it was as loud as a shout. "Why did you help us?" He did not look at her. For a long time, the only answer was the crackle and hiss of the fire. She thought he might not answer at all, that he would retreat back into the fortress of his silence. But then he drew a long, slow breath, a sound of immense effort, as if he were pulling the words up from a deep and frozen well. "This house," he began, his voice rough with disuse, "used to be full of noise." He paused, and she could hear the ghosts of that noise in his words. The sound of my wife humming while she cooked, the sound of my daughter's boots on the floorboards. Laughter. He spoke the last word as if it were a foreign language he was struggling to remember. "There was a fever 5 years back. It took them both in a week." He said it plainly, without inflection, a simple statement of a world-ending fact. After they were gone, the silence, it was too loud. It was a screaming thing. So I worked. I worked until I was too tired to hear it. But it was always there, waiting for me when I stopped. He finally turned his head and looked at her, and for the first time, she saw past the stoic mask to the profound, cavernous grief beneath. When I saw you in town, you and the boy, I didn't see charity. I saw, I don't know, a different kind of quiet. The quiet of people living is better than the quiet of people gone. He looked back at the fire. I didn't do it for you. I did it for me. I needed to fill this house with something other than ghosts. His confession was a raw, unvarnished thing, offered not as a plea for sympathy, but as a simple, brutal truth. It laid him bare, and in his vulnerability, Elena found the space for her own. She sat in the other chair by the fire, the space between them shrinking. She reached into a small pouch she always wore around her neck and drew out a small, intricately carved butterfly made of jade. One of its wings was broken, the edge jagged and sharp. She held it out in the palm of her hand. "My husband was a scholar," she began, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. "Not a farmer. He dreamed of books and quiet places. But we were from a land of turmoil, and men like him were not valued. We owed money to a powerful man, a man who saw people not as souls, but as figures on a ledger." She traced the broken wing with her finger. "We fled, hoping to find a new life here. My husband, he was not strong enough for the journey. He died of a fever, just like your family. He died in a dusty wagon in the middle of nowhere." She looked at the rancher, her eyes clear and direct. "The man you saw in town, the creditor, he was an agent for the man we fled. He tracked us. He claimed that my husband's debt passed to me, that Samuel and I were the payment. This butterfly was a gift from my husband. It broke during an argument with that man when he tried to take it from me. He said it was the only thing of value we had left." She closed her hand around the broken jade. "You did not just offer me work. You stood between me and a man who believes he owns me. You gave us a fortress, even if you only meant to give us a roof." Section in that moment, everything shifted. The last walls between them crumbled, washed away by the tide of their shared losses. They were no longer a man and his hired help. They were two survivors, two people who had lost everything and found themselves washed up on the same desolate shore. He looked at her, at the fierce, resilient woman who had endured so much, and he saw not a solution to his loneliness, but a fellow soul. He understood, with a sudden chilling clarity, that the true danger was not the town's gossip or the coming winter. It was the man with the ledger, the transactional villain who would not simply go away. The $3 he had paid was not an ending. It was merely the opening salvo in a war he now had to win. The false spring of early thaw was a liar, giving way to a final bitter spell of cold before surrendering to the true warmth. It was during this deceptive peace that the ultimate threat arrived. A buggy, far too clean and elegant for the muddy track leading to the homestead, crested the hill. In it sat two men, the creditor, looking smug and triumphant, and the town marshal, his face set in a mask of grim duty. Trailing behind them on horseback, a spectator to the unfolding drama, was the merchant's wife, her expression one of vindicated righteousness. The rancher saw them coming from the barn. He straightened up, his hand briefly touching the handle of the axe he'd been sharpening. He felt Elena come to stand beside him, Samuel clutching her hand. There was no fear in her stance, only a resolute stillness. The creditor stepped down from the buggy, a sheaf of papers in his hand. He was a man who wielded paper and ink like a weapon, confident in the power of the systems he manipulated. "Good day," he said, his voice slick with false cordiality. "I believe we have some unfinished business." The marshal dismounted, avoiding the rancher's eyes. "He has a writ of seizure," the lawman said, his voice heavy with reluctance. "Signed by a judge in the capital. It's a debt contract signed by your husband," he said to Elena. "It appears to be ironclad. It names you and the child as surety in the event of his death." The creditor smiled, holding out the papers. "The debt, with interest and my travel expenses, now stands at $200, a steep price for such damaged goods. I'm sure you'll agree." He looked Elena up and down with a contemptuous sneer. "You have 3 days to produce the sum. If you cannot, the law," he gestured to the marshal, "will enforce my legal claim. I will be taking my property." The ultimatum hung in the cold air, a death sentence for the fragile life they had begun to build. $200 was an impossible sum, more money than the rancher saw in a year. The marshal, a man who understood the law but not always justice, looked genuinely troubled. "My hands are tied. The paper is legal." After they left, a suffocating silence descended upon the homestead. The rancher stared at the spot where the buggy had been, the gears of his mind turning furiously. Desperation was a cold, sharp thing, but he was a man who knew how to operate in the cold. He would not let this happen. That night, the cabin became a war room. He spread his own meager financial records on the table. There was no hope there. The ranch was solvent, but cash poor. He had land and cattle, but nothing that could be liquidated in 3 days. Elena, however, was not idle. "Let me see the copy of the writ he left," she said. Her voice was calm, focused. He handed it to her, and she began to read, her finger tracing the dense, legalistic script. He had known she was literate, but he now saw a keen, analytical intelligence at work. She read not just the words, but the spaces between them, the structure of the clauses, the very architecture of the trap. "This company," she said, pointing to a name at the top of the document, "the Western Expansion Mercantile Company. I have heard of them. They prey on newcomers, offering loans with impossible terms. They are not merchants. They are predators." An idea, a desperate long shot, began to form in the rancher's mind. He had a past the town knew nothing about. Before he had come here seeking solitude, he had worked for a time as an agent for the railroad, a job that had required him to know the players, both legitimate and otherwise, in the territories. He still had a contact, a man in the territorial capital who worked in the telegraph office and had an encyclopedic memory for names and enterprises. The next morning, before dawn, he rode the 10 miles to the nearest telegraph station, a lonely shack by the railroad tracks. He sent a coded message, one they had used in the old days. It was simple. Inquiry WEMC. Urgent. Full report. Stop. He paid the operator and rode back, the uncertainty a knot in his stomach. It was a shot in the dark, a prayer sent down a wire. Now, all they could do was wait. The next 2 days were an exercise in controlled tension. They went about their chores, the unspoken deadline looming over every action. The rancher's foreman, a grizzled old hand who had worked for him for years, had seen the confrontation. He and the other 2 ranch hands said nothing, but they began working closer to the main cabin, their presence a silent, watchful perimeter of loyalty. On the morning of the 3rd day, the buggy appeared again. The creditor, the marshal, and the merchant's wife had returned to collect. The rancher met them in the yard. His foreman and hands stood behind him, unarmed but resolute. Elena stood on the porch of the cabin, Samuel behind her skirts. "Time's up," the creditor announced, stepping down from the buggy with an air of finality. "Do you have my money?" "No," the rancher said simply. The creditor's smile was predatory. "Then we are concluded." He turned to the marshal. "Do your duty." The marshal took a step forward, his hand on his pistol, his face a mask of misery. "I'm sorry," he began. "The law is the law." And then another sound cut through the tense standoff, the frantic drumming of horses' hooves. A lone rider was galloping toward them from the direction of the railroad, waving a piece of paper. He was the telegraph operator's son, and he skidded to a halt, breathing heavily. "A reply," he gasped, handing the telegram to the rancher. "Came in an hour ago. My pa said it was urgent." The rancher took the flimsy paper. The silence in the yard was absolute. He read the message aloud, his voice clear and steady. "WEMC. Assets frozen. Fraudulent enterprise. Proprietors indicted. Federal court. Agents wanted for conspiracy and extortion. Name matches yours. Hold and await federal marshals. Reward posted. Stop." He folded the paper and looked directly at the creditor. The man's smug confidence had evaporated, replaced by the pale, clammy sheen of pure panic. The legal document in his hand was now nothing more than evidence of his own crime. The trap he had so carefully laid had snapped shut on himself. The local marshal stared, his mouth agape, as he processed the information. His duty was suddenly, shockingly clear. He drew his pistol, but it was no longer pointed at the rancher. It was pointed directly at the creditor's chest. The merchant's wife let out a small, horrified gasp. Her moment of public triumph had transformed into a humiliating association with a wanted criminal. She backed away, her face ashen, and practically scrambled onto her horse, fleeing the scene without a backward glance. The creditor, his face a mask of disbelief and terror, was swiftly arrested. The marshal, securing the man's hands behind his back, looked over at the rancher with a newfound respect. "Looks like you had it handled," he said, a wry understatement. He tipped his hat to Elena, a gesture of apology and acknowledgement, before leading his stunned and silent prisoner away. The spring that followed the creditor's arrest was not just a change of season, it was a profound transformation. The melting snow seemed to carry away the last vestiges of the cold, hard silence that had defined the homestead for so long. The creek began to run again, its cheerful burble a constant, living sound. Wildflowers, defiant and vibrant, pushed up through the soil along the cabin walls. The world, it seemed, was breathing again. The homestead itself began to breathe too. The rancher, a man who had for years only maintained his property, began to build. He started work on a new room added to the side of the cabin, a proper bedroom for Elena and Samuel. The rhythmic thud of his hammer was a sound of creation, not just repair. It was the sound of a future being constructed, one log at a time. Elena, no longer a refugee, but a partner, planted a garden near the porch, her hands turning the dark, rich earth. She planted vegetables for the kitchen and, to the rancher's quiet surprise, a small patch of tenacious, cheerful flowers. The space inside the cabin changed as well. It was no longer a hollow shell housing one man's grief. It was a home. Samuel's laughter echoed off the timbered walls, a sound that filled the corners where shadows used to pool. The quiet murmur of conversation replaced the oppressive silence in the evenings. They would sit at the table after dinner, talking over the day's work, planning for the next. He discovered she had a sharp mind for numbers and strategy, and soon he was consulting her on which cattle to sell and when to plant the hay. Her insights were invaluable, and the ranch began to thrive in a way it never had under his solitary stewardship. The transformation in the man himself was the most profound. The deep, weary emptiness in his eyes was replaced by a quiet light. The hard lines around his mouth softened. One afternoon, watching Samuel attempt to mimic his wood chopping with a small stick, the rancher laughed. It was a startling sound, rusty from disuse, but it was full and genuine. Elena, hanging laundry on a line he had strung for her, paused and smiled. The ghost of the man he used to be was gone, replaced by the living reality of the man he was becoming. A husband, a father, the head of a family found in the wreckage of their old lives. The town's opinion, which had once seemed so important, faded into irrelevance. They were a self-contained world, a unit forged in adversity and sealed by loyalty. The foreman and the other hands treated Elena with a deep, abiding respect. She was no longer the stray the boss had brought home. She was the lady of the ranch, and her quiet strength had earned their unwavering allegiance. One evening in late summer, they sat together on the porch swing he had built. The sun was setting, painting the sky in strokes of orange and purple, and the air was soft and warm. Samuel was asleep in Elena's lap, his small hand clutching a fold of her dress. The sounds of the evening settled around them, the lowing of distant cattle, the chirp of crickets, the gentle creak of the swing. It was a peaceful, living silence, the kind he had once thought he would never hear again. Elena rested her head on his shoulder, a comfortable, familiar gesture. He put his arm around her, holding his new family close. He looked out at the land, his land, which stretched out before them under the vast, darkening sky. For years it had been a place of exile, a territory he patrolled but never truly inhabited. Now it was something more. "A home," he said, his voice quiet but sure in the twilight. "It's not the land you own, or the roof over your head." He looked down at the woman beside him and the child sleeping in her arms. "It is the people you choose to protect on it." She looked up at him, her eyes reflecting the last light of the day, and in her gaze he saw the end of his long winter and the promise of 1,000 seasons to come. They had mended each other, piece by broken piece, and built a sanctuary not of wood and stone, but of shared hope, and it was more than enough.